Hello everyone, welcome back to Coach Tom. In this video, we will learn about exception handling in Spring Boot. Exception handling is a crucial aspect of building good applications. Spring Boot provides several ways to manage exceptions that occur during application execution. First is user experience, as it provides meaningful error messages to users. Second is application stability. It prevents unexpected application crashes. Third is error logging, as it helps in debugging and identifying issues. And finally, the fourth one is centralized error handling, as it enhances code maintainability and consistency. First, we will look at the code together. This means understanding what each part does and how it works. Then, we will tackle errors. Sometimes things go wrong in code and we need to handle these unexpected problems. That's where exception handling comes in. It's like having a plan for when something bad happens. We will also learn how to make sure data is entered correctly using Spring Boot validations. We will integrate our code with MySQL database. To make our code easier to write and read, we will use records and Lombok annotations. These are like special tools that help us write less code but do more. And finally, we will also learn how to handle errors using RestControllerAdvice and exception handler annotations. Let's get started. The project is organized into distinct packages for improved clarity. We have a controller, DAO, DTO, exceptions, repository, service, and utils packages. As you notice, exceptions are empty as of now. First, we can look at the existing error messages before starting with this exceptions implementation, and we will see how the application responds and where the exceptions are thrown. And once we have a clear picture of that, we can implement this exception handling. Now, let's start by adding the necessary dependencies to our build.gradle file. These are the required dependencies for this project, and the complete code including dependencies will be available on GitHub. I will share the link in description. This is the default starter web of Spring Boot applications, and along with that, I've used this JPA dependency, validation dependency, Lombok dependency, and MySQL connector dependency. Now, let's examine the users class. This is a DAO class. DAO here means data access object class, which is essentially a bridge between your application and the database. It includes all the database interactions from our applications, such as creating database connections, executing SQL queries in our repo interface, that is repository interface, performing CRUD operations like save, find by ID, delete by ID, etc. I've also included ID, name, email, and internal user ID. Here, internal user ID is just for example to show the use of DAO, that is DAO, and DTO. I will explain it later, but just consider this variable over here. At ID annotation indicates that ID is the primary key, and this generation type will automatically generate and increments its value for each new user record added in our database. As I said earlier, to simplify our code and save time, I've used Lombok annotations. So this will automatically generate repetitive code like getters, setters, constructors, and more. If you're unfamiliar with Lombok, I recommend checking out my another video tutorial. I will provide a link in description, or I will add an info card at the top. Also, I've used entity annotation and at table annotation. To create the table with exact name as we want, we need to specify this name when setting it up. This way, we have full control over the table's name. And here, the table's name would be users. This is users DAO class. Now, let's go to our repository layer. Repository, user repository. Here, user repository will extend JPA repository, and we pass users and long. Users would be the DAO class, which we need to save the data into database, and long will be the primary key type. It can also be string or a wrapper integer or any other data type as required. And I repeat, this is a JPA repository which is an interface provided by Spring Data JPA that offers a set of predefined methods for CRUD operations. This is users, which is our DO layer, and inside the DO layer, what is the primary key type? That will be long. So we need to use long at this place. Hope it's clear. Now let's examine our user DTO. DTO means data transfer object that carries data between layers of an application. It primarily used to transfer data from the DAO layer to the UI layer or the presentation layer. Key points about DTO are: it improves performance by reducing data transferred. It enhances security by exposing only necessary data. As you notice, I've used record over here as it just holds the data, but you can also use classes with getters and setters as well. And you should also notice that I've used this Spring Boot validation annotations. This not blank is from Spring Boot validation dependency, which I showed at the beginning of the video. And email is also a Spring Boot validation dependency. So not blank will make sure that the username should not be empty or null. And here not blank will make sure that email is not empty or null. And at this email annotation will make sure that it should be in the valid email format. And also notice that I've used only 3 variables here instead of 4 variables as per in DO layer. Just consider that we don't want to show this information to our client or users. That is the reason why we need user DTO class, which enhances security by exposing only necessary data. Here we can just hide this particular internal user ID and show only the data which is needed by the user. So consider one more example. If you have a password field here, no need to add that particular field in the DTO. Hope it's clear. And this email annotation is a simple check. If you need to be really sure that email is valid, you might want to consider other library dependencies. I'm doing this check here itself because let's imagine there are around 15 to 20 variables. Doing the validation for each field in our service layer would be really difficult, or it's a repetitive task. So I'm adding this validation when I accept the data from the user itself. I will show this live example when we run the application. Now, let's go to mapper class, which is inside utils. This mapper class will convert DAO to DTO, that is our users class to DTO. As I said, if there are extra fields, we need to map only the required fields in our user DTO. So that's why I'm using this generic user mapper class. So here I'm converting user DAO to user DTO. And here I'm converting DTO to DAO. You can pause the video and just look at this code once. Now let's go to the service layer. This service class is like a manager of our application which handles business logic. It does the main work of creating, reading, updating, and deleting informations called CRUD. To do these things, it asks the help of repository, which is like a helper that knows how to talk with the database. This user repository we have already come across, that is, it is an interface which extends JPA repository. So in this user service, there is a create user method which will create the user, and this is a user DTO, and we will use this mapper to convert the user DTO to user DAO, and I'm setting this internal user ID, which is the variable only specific to DAO layer and not the DTO layer, which means the user need not to know about this specific variable. So we will show only required variables, that is name, email, and ID. And finally, we save this user into our database. And also, if you notice, I'm doing a check here and I'm adding a log. This log is with the help of this SLF4j, which is of a Lombok dependency. This SLF4j will help us to add this simple log statements in our code. And when the ID is not equal to null, that means from our request or a controller, when a user enters the ID value, it will throw the error. As we are creating the user, we should not give the permission to set their own IDs. So it will check this condition over here. Here, I'm just checking for the null. We can also have more validation checks here as well. In get user, I will fetch the user by the given ID. Update user, same, it accepts the user DTO. It will map it into a DO class and then saves the value into database. We will use this mapper to convert it back into a DTO and return it back to our controller layer. And finally, delete user. Here we will delete the user based on the given ID if the user exists. And also notice this runtime exceptions as this is important in this tutorial. Now let's go to our controller layer. This is a class where we perform HTTP operations. In this tutorial, I've covered all the major HTTP requests like post to create the user, get to get the value, to get the details of a particular user, put to update the user, and delete to delete a user from our database using the ID. And notice that I've used at valid annotations. So if you ask why do we need this, we need that because inside our user DTO we have added this not blank and at email, right? In order to make sure that this annotation should work, we need to add at valid annotations in our controller layer where we accept this user DTO. Now let's go to our application.properties file. Here we have configured our database connection. Please replace these values with your local DB connection values. Let's run the application and check how the APIs behave and also how the exceptions behave now. The application is started. Before starting this application, also you should make sure that your MySQL server is running and you have this SQL workbench open so that we can view the data, and server should be running in the background. Please make sure of that. As you notice, we have ID, email, internal user ID, and username in our database table. Now let's go to our Insomnia app to send the request. You can use Postman as well. I will increase the font of this. Now let's create this user. This is a post request where we create the user, which is equivalent to this method in our code. And if you notice, I use request mapping as API/v1/users, and I've added the same in a path as well. I'll click on send. User ID is created. Now let's fetch the data. The same data is fetched. Let's update the email ID for Charles, and ID is 1 as we know because we created it. Now let's update this. It is updated. Now let's fetch this particular user ID again. This time the email should be updated. Yes, it is updated, which means create, read, update are working fine. Now let's delete that particular user. User deleted. This is also as expected. Now let's see how this particular code will handle the error. If I try to fetch this now, it should have said no user found for this particular ID, but instead it says internal server error as we have thrown runtime exception from our class. Even if I throw this runtime exception, this message user not found is not shown here in our response. This is where we need exception handling in our Spring Boot project. Let's see one more example. While creating, I will try to pass the data for ID. According to the code, this should throw the error because I'm doing this check. If user ID is not equal to null, then they should throw the user ID must be null while creating the user error. Let's see. Again, we get the internal server error without expected message. Now let's handle this code with exception handlers. First, let's create an exception class which will occur when user is not found. I'll create a class inside exceptions package and I will name the class as user not found exception.class. So we have created the class. Now we will extend it by runtime exception and we will add one constructor. The constructor which I'm adding contains only a single message, but if you want any throwable or any other constructors, you can use it. But in this tutorial, I'll be using this single parameter constructor. And finally, let's add a response status annotation. So this will tell us what kind of response to be given to the user when this exception occurs. So in this case, when user is not found, I will give HTTP status not found. Now let's replace runtime exception with user not found exception in our service class. This is user not found exception, import class, and here as well. When we try to delete by wrong ID, we should throw this exception. Now let's run this application. As the database is empty now, let's try to fetch with user1. We get the expected response code, but still we are not clear about the error message. Earlier it was 500 internal server and now it is 404 not found. So now let's add our custom exception handler class in our project so that we can customize the error response as we want and also pass the error message. Let's go back to IntelliJ. Let's create a new class inside exceptions and name it as custom exception handler. This custom exception handler will extend response entity exception handler. If you ask why we need to extend it with response entity exception handler, this response entity exception handler will provide some pre-built methods to handle common exceptions. And along with this, you can also create your own methods for specific exception types. What do I mean by pre-built methods is, let's go inside this exception handler. If you see the structure of it, if you notice there are some handle HTTP request method not supported, handle handler method validation exception. So these are the common pre-built exceptions which we can use and customize according to our requirement. Also, we can add exception handler for the custom class which we create. So in this case, it will be user not found exception. By default, you know the behavior of user not found exception. That is, we don't get the error message, but we get this timestamp, status, error, path. So how will the user will know why this particular request has failed? We need to send the message, right? So we can do that by using exception handler. Before going to create the method for user not found exception, I will show a error response DTO which I have created. So this error response DTO will be the format in which the error response will be thrown. So in our Postman or Insomnia, the response will be message, description, and timestamp. So these three keys will be there. So this is the expected format in this project. If you want any other keys in this, you can change it as per the requirement. Now let's go back to our custom exception handler and create a method. I have created this particular method to handle our new class that is user not found exception, and I've added this user not found exception inside the exception handler annotation. And once we do that, we'll go inside this method. This is the error response DTO. This is my custom DTO class, which I've created, as I explained earlier, where message, description, and timestamp will be in our error message response, that is payload. And finally, I'm adding the values into this record, that is exception.getMessage. Exception.getMessage is nothing but the value which we pass inside the user not found exception in our service class. This getMessage will print the value which we pass inside our service layer. And second one is in our responsive is description. So this description can be anything, but in this case, I've added in what path that particular exception occurs. So that is /API /v1/users/ID, whichever we pass, right? It will give us the path. And then finally, in our response DTO, it is timestamp. That is when the exception occurred. So this will make sure to print the local date time now value. And then we return this response DTO inside a response entity class and return the status code as not found, that is 404. Now let's run this application and see how the behavior has changed when we fetch the user with invalid value or non-existent value. And also, before starting the application, we need to add this REST controller advice annotation at the top of custom exception handler. So if you ask what is REST controller advice, REST controller advice annotation tells Spring that this class is responsible for handling exceptions in our controllers. Now let's run this application. The application had started. Now let's do the same get request. This time we get a custom message where it says user not found. Description is the endpoint which we hit and the current timestamp. This looks better, right? And also the status code will be 404 not found instead of 500 internal server error. So by this, it will be clear for the user that why this particular request failed. Now let's do the same thing in our user service when it is this kind of exceptions where user ID must not be null or say user ID must be null, those exceptions. I will create a class named unable to process exception for that, and I will throw 400 bad request. Let's create that class. To save the time, I've already created this unable to process exception. So the only difference will be the name of the class and the response status when compared to our earlier user not found name exception. And inside our custom exception handler, we need to create one more method. This is for unable to process exception, and earlier it was for user not found exception. And here the difference is the response status again. We also need to update this user not found exception to unable to process exception. Now let's go back to our service class and change runtime exception to unable to process exception wherever it is required. So we have replaced all the runtime exception with user not found exception and unable to process exception. Now let's run this application and see the output. Application has started. Now let's trigger the post API with passing ID. So when creating the user in the service class, we have added a if clause to throw the exception. Now let's see. Yes, we get the expected error message saying user ID must be null while creating the user. Our scenarios, which was earlier bad request exception, has been replaced with unable to process exception and username not found exception. Now, if you remember, we also added not blank and at email annotations to our user DTO class. Let's see if it is working or not. I will pass empty value for username. As you notice, we are not getting the value which we have passed inside at not blank. That is, username must not be null. What about when we pass an invalid email and pass the name? For this as well, we are not getting the expected response of the message which we have inside our message. So now let's add a exception handler for this behavior as well. As it is a field level annotation, we can't throw new exception, correct? And also we have a pre-built exception handler inside this response entity exception handler for handling those kind of scenarios. Let's search for that method. So this is the method which is pre-built handle method argument not valid. So this will help us to write a custom exception when we enter the invalid values for our email and username. Let's do that. Let's override this existing method. Override. Here instead of this return super handle method argument not valid, here there are a couple of changes. One is we need to identify what is the field and what is the message. So here field is username and message will be this username must not be null. Let's do the code. So I've already added the code to save the time. Here the exception method argument not valid exception will give us a binding result which contains the field errors. Here field errors is a list which contains our field name and the error message which we want. That is the field name and the error message which we want. So in this case, I'm using a map to convert that particular field error list into particular string, that is default message. Here default message will be the error message and I'm collecting it into the list. And finally, I'm using string.join to join this particular list of elements and using a delimiter. And finally, the response inside the response DTO, I'm passing this error message, which is nothing but a list of error messages, that is this default messages. So if there is only one error, it will give us username must not be null. And in the description part, I am writing number of errors found. Let's say a username is blank and I pass an invalid value to email. The list size will be 2, that is username must not be null and in invalid email format. And finally, the local date time dot now. And this will be the bad request. Now let's run this application. Application has started. Now let's test various scenarios for our method argument not valid exception. So here will not pass the value to username and email is also invalid. As we notice, we get multiple exceptions or error messages. Now let's say I will enter a valid email and username will be empty. Username must not be null. Error bound is 1. What if both are empty? Same. And I will pass the username here and email will be empty. Email must not be null. These are the field level check so that it will prevent these values to enter inside our service layer. So before entering our service layer itself, we are doing those checks so that it will skip us to do those validations over here. Just imagine if there are 20 variables and you need to do the check each and every time when the particular DTO is called. That is not a good way to handle those. So that is why I've used this not blank and email. Similar to not blank and email, there are many more annotations which comes under validations. I will try to make a video on that. And this is exception handling. Thank you for watching.